a tough group. So the real test about the river, though, is are your sump pumps running any slower? Any sump pumps getting better? Yes. Okay. Steve, all right. Well, Stephanie, because that went so fast. Oh, wait, pardon me. We have an announcement.
Rotary boys and girls, one thing Rotary does exceptionally well is to demonstrate an attitude of profound gratitude for those who lead in service. In an all too short time, President Worgan's term of service will come to a successful conclusion. I got a good speechwriter. I do not look forward to following in his footsteps. Looking back on his tenure, I note Rand has increased our impact, making a difference in Vermilion. He has expanded our reach, being people for others outside Rotary. He has enhanced participant engagement, getting out there and motivating everybody to just do it. He has increased our ability to adapt, embracing change through innovation, creativity, and awareness of community needs. We meet Wednesday now to accommodate our journalism school's need for academic space on Tuesday, welcoming all guests in a spirit of joy and hospitality, and so much more. He's recruited 10 new members during his tenure. He's conducted club assemblies at the start and during the fiscal year to set and review our goal achievement. He's established a new club, Polio Plus program, creating a new good news bucket and a bucket club contribution towards an annual goal of $20 per member. He's increased club contribution to the Rotary Foundation. He's meaningfully supported community organizations and activities like the second grade bike helmet safety program, helped organize the Christmas basket partnership with the Lions Club, co-sponsored the Christmas giving tree, obtained a $4,000 district grant to purchase a commercial stove for our new Community Connection Center, matching it with $4,000 raised by our Duck Grand Prix race. He supported Vermilion Robotics Club, sent high school students to the Rotary Youth Leadership Camp, supported the VHS German Club and Exchange Program and the VHS Choir, supported Read Across America Day books for kindergartners, supported Vermilion Community Theater, supported the VHS Theater, supported Vermilion Senior Center's Meals on Wheels, supported Vermilion Special Olympics, provided the VHS student scholarships, and supported South Dakota Shakespeare Festival financially and with volunteer presentation. And on it goes. Leadership matters, and President Rand has led from the front. Rand demonstrates what is best in Rotary, selfless service. We have a little memento, Rand, that we want to remember your leadership year by because it was special. Rotarians, would you join me in thanking the servant of all because he is the greatest of all.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I didn't anticipate this, and I'm not going to give you a speech. But thank you very much. You're very kind. No, I really didn't know this was coming. All right, so up next, Stephanie Rissler, senior producer with South Dakota Public Broadcasting. Please wave. All right, everybody say hi, Stephanie. Hi. All right, then we have Crystal Schoenbauer. Very German, I'm thinking. Is that correct? All right, everybody say hi, Crystal. Hi. All right, they're coming up. Please approach the podium. Vanish, South Dakota. Towns of Yesterday is a production of SDPB, produced by Stephanie Rissler, videography by Crystal. The program focuses on the many towns, villages, and communities across South Dakota that have vanished or are a shell of their former selves. The two have traveled the entire state over the past 9 months, collecting interviews, historical documents, and capturing the images of what these towns look like today. 55 locations have been visited, with close to 400 towns on the list. Today, we will see a sneak peek of Vanish, South Dakota, Towns of Yesterday. Please welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having us. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm Stephanie Rissler. I've been with the network now going on 23 years. Traveled the state a lot during my time. I my real gig with the network, I do a talk show every Thursday night. I do a public affairs program called South Dakota Focus. I do all of our political debates. I moderate those. I produce documentaries. I've got about 12 under my belt, one of which I've done with Senator Art Rush on our county courthouses. So through all of those travels, and I'm sure a lot of you have this same idea going through your mind, we go past those buildings that are falling down, those homesteads that are not, nobody lives in them anymore, and we think, man, I wonder what happened to those people. Where did they go? Was there a town here? Does the family still own the land? So that's always been in my mind as I've traveled the state. Doing interviews with people, I would oftentimes interview folks that would talk about towns that they grew up in, maybe their family grew up in. So I said, someday I want to go back and do something, whether it was for online, a one-time show, or a documentary on some of these towns that have vanished. So the team allowed me to go around Watertown and the north central part of our state, and I did just a 10-minute video on towns around the area that have disappeared. We put it on television, we put it online, and the feedback we received was overwhelming to the point we had to create a Facebook page all to itself. So we chewed on the idea, should we do more? And absolutely we should do more, because the stories that are out there are unbelievable and the history is dying. Many of these towns were small. They were around maybe a year, maybe 10 years, and a lot of that history is not being documented. So they said, yep, get out there, let's do an hour. Crystal, who is with me, just celebrated 1 year. I think she had been with us for maybe a couple of weeks, and they said, you're gonna go with Stephanie across the entire state, and you might wanna buy boots that will protect you from rattlesnakes. So.
I would just like to add, I did go out and check. They were $300. I decided to play roulette.
And she won. So it has been so much fun traveling. We asked South Dakotans, give us some ideas of these towns that we should go to, knowing we would probably get 30, 40, maybe 50 suggestions, because folks had started to send them in. We are almost to 400. Now, they're not all big towns that have disappeared. Some of them are like Burbank. They never were really that big, but they are a shell of their former selves. Some of them have completely vanished. You would never even know there was a building there. What we also discovered right away, the people that remember the stories or kind of have some information on the stories, they're dying. So we quickly decided we were going to work as hard as we can, as long as we could, to find these people, interview them, get whatever pictures they have, and document it, because a lot of that history is being lost. So what we're going to see today is just a 12-minute, it's kind of a sneak peek. Crystal and I are actually editing the documentary as we speak. It will air October 19th. Now, if anybody's interested, we have been traveling the state showing a 30-minute clip of it, so it showcases far more than what we'll see today. But we will be here in Vermillion on August 12th, and they are going to showcase it in the movie theater. We've done this a couple times across the state. We went to Hot Springs and did it in the movie theater. They've never had more than about 75 people in the movie theater there. They were so full. It was the first time they've ever had this many people in the theater. We had to bring chairs in and turn people away. So it let us know people want to hold on to that history as long as they could. And I share this with you because my hope is once this project is done, they'll allow us to do more, because there are so many more stories to tell. Quickly, just a couple towns that we went to around our area. I don't know if anybody here has ever heard of Texas Town. It's in Union County, down by Jefferson. It was one of the first towns that we went to. There's not a lot written about it. In fact, the historians put together, it's about a one-paragraph bit of information. But what we have gathered is it lasted from 1860 to 1870. It was right on the river. The river's not by it anymore. It was a steamboat community. People would come up, tie up to the big cottonwoods, and do business in Texas Town. There was a hotel. The lumber yard provided lumber to Elk Point and some of the other areas. Some cafes, a general store. It was a thriving little community from what they can gather. When the railroad finally did go through Elk Point, they didn't need those steamboats anymore, so it disappeared. All that's left today is the cemetery. And on the cemetery, it does say Dakota Territory, Texas Town. It was named that because they believe it was created from African American slaves that made their way up, escaped slavery, and settled in Texas Town. There are about 30 graves that are marked, but there are so many more in there that aren't even marked. It's an interesting story, and it was one of the first ones that we went to. Some of the historians have told us there are more towns like this along the Missouri River. One of which I do know in Sully County. It's on private land, and the landowner wants to keep it private, and we respect that. And we'll continue to dig to see if we can find more. The other town is called Hooker. Hooker is in Turner County. And there is one guy that still lives there and his son. It was never very big, but when I was doing my interview with him, I always ask, well, how did a town get its name? And he gave me a colorful story about ladies that created Hooker, and it was named after their profession. So Crystal and I thought, oh, I don't know how we're gonna do this. How do we show that? So fast forward, I go to the Turner County Historical Society, and we interview the historian, because we always do our fact checking. And he said Hooker was actually named after John Hooker, who settled in the area, and there's no evidence that prostitutes came through and created a community. What we also found out is there are a lot of these stories that have been passed down, that oral history, and they do not match up with what historians have found. So we have been sensitive to this, and as we've written the script, we make sure we share those colorful stories, but also provide the true facts that our historians have been able to dig up. So before we watch this, I'm gonna show you one more thing. We have such an awesome team at SDPB. We have a marketing staff, and they've been helping us find maps. So when we've been trying to find these towns, they've put together a bunch of maps from the Library of Congress, and they created this map for us, and it shows all the towns that we have been to that have disappeared or are vanishing, plus many more towns that we've not been to yet that we hope to go to, and then some. They found a lady in Sioux City who makes every single one of these by hand. So it's like several maps on top of each other. And we said, you know, once this project is done, we want to showcase it on SDPB. And for those that support the programming, this will become one of the thank you gifts. And I bought one right away. It sits above my bar, and I enjoy my South Dakota made wine from Valiant Vineyards and look at all these towns. And then these t-shirts are so fun. They made these t-shirts as well, but it has the list of all of the towns that are included in the documentary. So we actually traveled to about 55 towns, all of which will be shown, but what we've discovered, we're only gonna be able to tell the story of about 35 of them. But all of these towns are in the doc, and hopefully we can continue our journey over the next year and create more. So I'll let you guys go ahead and watch this 12-minute clip, and if there are any questions when we're all done, we're happy to answer those.
As the trend is in America, smaller towns are dying. As the population gets older, they need medical services and so forth. And thus, the population leaves, the towns decline, tax base is gone, buildings deteriorate. County and town histories cover a wide range of quality of effort. A few of them are exceptionally well done, a lot of thorough research with the history of the towns and of the businesses and of cemeteries and other than just the family history section. Others are simply that. They're filled with family history with maybe 5 pages devoted to the real history, the economic history, the social history. So that's the sad story. When you go to research many of these places, there isn't a whole lot of material.
The history in this area is very, very rich. There's a lot of stuff that goes unsaid. We're kind of the forgotten part of South Dakota. You hear of the Black Hills and you hear of the Badlands. And you know, this is the land of Sitting Bull. Of all your great Indian chiefs came out of this area, out of Corson County or the Standing Rock Reservation. And the leadership that came from those Indian people, and then as it transitions into the homestead days and the coal mining and the cattle ranching and those huge cattle ranches at the turn of the century between 1890 and 1910. It's just very, very rich in history.
So this was all developed, and there would have been businesses every 25 feet, because these lots are all platted out for 25 feet. But this was all developed, and there was businesses all along here. And then in the 30s and 40s, there was a big fire, and it wiped out almost all of these businesses.
And the carloads of coal that used to go on a fire steel in the 20s, 30s, and 40s was probably some of the biggest coal mining the state of South Dakota has ever seen. The amount of people that used to live there, you know, there was well over 500 people that lived in the fire steel area. And today you go through there and there's 6 or 8. And they used to have a flour mill and all your general stores and auto parts dealerships and implements and all that stuff, and it's all gone. And you can still see the bank vault.
But the town of Firesteel took it a step further and developed it into an industry. Firesteel coal was used by most of the colleges, and at one time heated the state capitol building. The company, because they had a railroad, they had a branch of the Milwaukee Road serving the town. They were able to ship all this stuff out by rail car, and they operated until 1959. The railroad was the major influence in South Dakota for so many places. Where the route of the railroad was going to be actually made or broke many a town.
Nashville was built there. Camp Crook started first, and then the next year or two, Nashville got started back up the creek from Camp Crook. Around 1884 is when Nashville would have gotten started. And he had a little store there, from what I understand. It lasted for a while, and it got a post office. And then by about 1887 or thereabouts, a guy named Stokes came in and settled on a claim there where Harding sits now, and then he went and bought out the Nashville store and moved it down to his place. And then he ended up with the post office a few years after that, and his daughter ran it, as far as I can tell. The old house that Stokes built, and there was a warehouse that they had that has been converted into kind of a garage, and the old dance hall, the modern Woodman Hall originally, that's still standing.
There was at least 26 ghost towns listed in Custer County, and of all them 26, there's very few left that show you could find signs of them being still there. Spokane is one that has most of the old buildings and the old mine stuff there. Some places are just gone and went right back to nature, and all it is just something written on paper that the town was there. Everybody was looking for gold. It's like the family that founded Spokane. It was a Judd family, and they come west and they found this little vein in the side of a hill over here in the eastern part of the hills, and he set up a claim there in a cold winter night, and they had the rocks on the stove, and in the morning there was a puddle of silver on the stove, and they found out there was lead in this mine. And more people come, and they built their homes there, and before you know it, there was a town. Then there was a Mr. Shepherd, and he staked his claim, but he stuck his stake a little farther over where he should have. And this Mr. Cox, it was over on his side of the land, and one day Mr. Shepherd got shot with a shotgun, and it took him a while to die. Nobody witnessed the shooting, so they couldn't really say that Mr. Cox shot him, but everybody knew he did. But Mr. Shepherd is buried on the mine site. I often think some night when it gets dark and the moon comes over the hill and it gets real quiet, you can almost hear him out there wailing.
The 100 square miles of the Black Hills were just peppered with these little small towns. Most have been pretty much vanished. If you went out there in the summers, you'd be hard pressed to find many ruins. Trojan was about 6 miles out of Lead to the west, up by the ski slopes, right on the edge of Terry Peak. Major mining area. It was called the Ruby Basin, which was a conglomerate of many mines. It was a small metropolitan area. Trojan itself was originally known as Portland. Portland became the Trojan Mining Company, and then I think it was about in the 19-teens when it became the Bald Mountain Mining Company. It was a town with its businesses, grocery stores. It had its own school, which was the last building demolished. They didn't demolish that until 2010. No, it was a major town, right up there with Lead and Deadwood. It was a railroad center, not only for the Black Hills railroads like the Burlington and the Chicago Northwestern, but there was spurs off of those that went out to some of these smaller towns and smaller mines that have since disappeared. And then the mine itself had quite a system of rails. But it was a major producer right up there with Homestake up until 1959. Right after it closed, there was some businessmen from Milwaukee, Wisconsin that wanted to build a tourist resort up there. And they actually did get a start with it. Going back to railroads, they took trains to 2 different sites full of tourists. I was one of those tourists and just thought that was the greatest thing in the world. They were calling it the Top of the Hills. And at one point, they were trying to evict any of the residents that were left because they wanted all the buildings that were any good to be used in their resort plans. But it was major plans. It only lasted about 2 years. And at that time, the town was pretty much vacant. The next inhabitants of the town of Trojan were migrants from eastern South Dakota. Many of the young folks that came out to the Black Hills from the Sioux Falls and surrounding area ended up settling in Trojan. It was the revival. It really truly was the revival of Trojan. It was thriving with all these young folks. They had bands up there. I think Red Willow was up there, Jack Kreitzer. Yeah, in the 60s and the 70s in particular, it was quite thriving with all these young folks. But the first time I found it, I kind of came in the back door. We were out running around the woods, and I had no idea really where I was. And all of a sudden, we came around the curve on this railroad grade, and here was this big, huge mill that I'd been to as a little kid when they tried to make this tourist thing. But I just kind of accidentally stumbled on it and thought, oh, wow, this is great. And then I started, after that, going up there fairly often. It was quite a place. I used to love to four-wheel drive up there. There was another mine that was first part of Wharf that they mined. It was called the Reliance Mine. And I loved prowling around in these mines. It was just a great place to explore. A lot of history, a lot of artifacts, and it was all still there. You could go out and touch it, take pictures of it, take people there and show it to them, but it's all gone.
Growing up in Spearfish, Tinton was kind of always in the background. There was a place called Tinton Road. And in high school, we used to go up Tinton Road and go do things that we probably shouldn't have done. But I've always been outdoorsy, so when I went to the woods, I went up Tinton Road. And in 1983, I went hunting with a buddy of mine, Scott Christensen, and we drove up here, and the next thing you know, we went by the town of Tinton. It was like the first time I'd seen it since, probably the early 70s. And I just thought it was great. I mean, here was a ready-made town sitting in the woods all by itself. And it was kind of mysterious and interesting all at the same time. The construction of Tinton began in November of 1902, but it didn't begin to function as a community per se until the late spring, early summer of 1903. And there was a boarding house for the bachelor miners. There were cottages for the miners that had families. There was the post office in the early days. There was a bank. There was a stagecoach that came up here 3 times a week in the early days.
And it was, by the summer of 1903, it was a thriving little metropolis. It was kind of the darling of the Black Hills at that point. There was a school. It changed locations. These buildings, their functions changed over the years. One time the mercantile was the boarding house, and then the boarding house became the schoolhouse, and then it was torn down. They switched places for the post office at least twice. But the school that everyone associates with Tinton now was built in 1936, and it was on the north end of town. And there were approximately 25 students in 2 classrooms. As far as I'm concerned, Tinton is still the best example of a ghost town in the Black Hills region. And the term ghost town is alluring all by itself. Now, once you start looking at photographs of how it used to be, maybe 100 years ago or 120 years ago, interest picks up in most people. The last step in this process is to actually visit it. And it doesn't take too much imagination once you visit a ghost town to get a sense of what it must have been like. It's like putting together a century-old jigsaw puzzle that explains the past. You put enough pieces together, it becomes obvious, at least to me, that Tinton isn't a ghost town. It's a place where history comes alive and the past becomes real.
Everything is vanishing so quickly today. It's important. If you want a record of any sort, you better do it now. While we preserve the past, we'll do our very best, and that's what all historians do, and hopefully there'll be a continued interest in the past. Without a past, there isn't much of a future.
Every time I see it, I feel a little sad, but also fortunate that we're able to do this and go out and document it. I'm going to point out one thing. If you guys all go back when they were talking about Spokane, the story where the guy got shot, we were in Rapid City a month or so ago at a screening, and that same gentleman who we interviewed came to our screening to be a presenter. And at the end of the screening, he was speaking about Spokane, and he informed us and the audience that he had found some new information. He had been doing some research, and it turns out that Mrs. Cox, on her deathbed, admitted to shooting Mr. Shepard. It was never Mr. Cox, it was her. She had dressed up in his clothes because he was far too nice to hurt anyone, and she was a very ornery woman, and she shot him and admitted it on her deathbed. So now we have to rewrite the script a little bit to make sure that history is accurate. So that's a look at Vanished. I know you guys only have about 5 more minutes or so, but if anybody has any questions, we'd sure be happy to answer them, or if you have suggestions on a town.
Are you going to publish any kind of map that shows the locations of these dead towns or non-existent towns?
We do. So the wooden map we have, but there is also a paper map. And it's about the same size as that wooden map, but it's a paper version, and it comes framed. But it's not a fancy frame by any mean, but that will be another portion of what we're doing. Yep. Yeah.
What was the common denominator for those towns to become a ghost town? Was it greed, people buying out each other? Was it the railroad?
It was the railroad. The railroad. Yep. Mostly the railroad. If we want to talk about the common denominator, the railroad would make or break a town. The only place where that is not true is Harding County, because there is no railroad in Harding County. Before it reached Harding County, it went up through North Dakota and over. We visited 4 towns in Harding County: Ralph, Ladner, Nashville, and Harding, and there were many things, and those actually weren't towns. Those were more gathering places, so you would have maybe a general store, a post office, a school, and a church. There was many things that made those communities disappear. A lot of it had to do with the harsh life out in Harding County. But the railroad, And there were many towns that would pop up because they got word or there were rumors that the railroad was coming their way. So they were ready to go, and then the railroad decided to bypass that town. So they were only there for a few years, and all that's left is maybe a cemetery with 10 people in it. The railroad for sure.
Do you have any other Missouri River towns like in this region?
Not for this particular program. We have several that are on our list that we hope to go to. Wheeler is one that we know is under the water. But in terms of on the river in our area, no, not right now. But there are several in southeastern South Dakota. Blaha is one that I really wanted to go to, but it's on private land, and the gentleman who owns it was out of town, so I'm hoping I can get there. But it's over by Scotland, and from what I understand, Blaha and then Tuscan. Tuscan is over on the James River as we go east. At one time, Tuscan was known for the clams that they would get out of the James River, and they had a pretty good business at taking those clams to make buttons. The railroad went through there. They could get those clam shells on the railroad and ship them out. And so I'm hoping to go back there too. Yeah.
I noticed a couple of the towns died or had some tragic incident in 1959. Was there something significant about that year? Change in the railroad industry or something?
I think in the Black Hills, it had a lot to do with the mining, and kind of between the 30s and the 60s, they just started to run out of their resources and they disappeared. Yeah.
You know, Bonham, the town of Bonham is a really significant town because that was part of the three-way deal. The three big towns in the territory were Yankton, Vermilion, and Bonham, and they divvied up that's when the Vermilion got the university, Yankton got the capital, and Bonham was supposed to get the penitentiary. And Bonham is no longer there, other than the cemetery.
And I know that because you taught me that, Senator, when we did our documentary. Yeah, there's so much more we can tell. I feel like we have just scratched the surface. It's unbelievable. Yeah. Yeah.
What was like if you could think of one or two towns that had like the highest boom to the biggest bust, like that were, there was one town that they mentioned 500 people, and now it's not.
That's a big one. Fire Steel, which supplied a lot of the coal to the state capitol building. One that I can think of right now was the town of Terry. We didn't put it in this particular screening. Terry was a mining town in Lawrence County, and it was huge. And what was interesting about Terry, it is where Calamity Jane died. And from what the historian, Dr. David Wolf, told us, she had been in Deadwood. She was kind of on her last leg. She knew she was on her last leg. And she would see people in Deadwood, and they'd say, "Hey, Calamity, can I buy you a drink?" Sure. Well, that got kind of old after a while. So they put her on a train in Deadwood and sent her to Terry, where she was only there for about a week, and she died of inflammation of the bowels. Well, there were some entrepreneurs from the Deadwood area that quickly made it to Terry, took her body, shipped it back to Deadwood, buried her next to Wild Bill, which they think he probably would have been upset with. And that was the benefit to Deadwood and the hurt to Terry. But Terry was a very thriving town. I think the number they gave us was in the thousands, about 1,200 people. Today, there's just rock. You would never even know. It's underneath a mine, and it's all reclamation work. So that's one of them. I'm trying to think if there is.
Wasn't Albee?
Albee in Grant County had a couple hundred people, and it's right on the border. Well, it's not far from Gary. It was pretty big. Yeah, those are the two that I can think of right now. Yeah.
There are some towns that probably 50 years from now will be almost ghost towns. Have you kind of identified those and are to be proactive about trying to figure out how we preserve those towns?
Yes, and almost by accident, because as we would get names coming in, some of those names are towns that aren't quite vanished, and people would come to us and say, "Hey, we are still here. So we said, okay. So we have a database and we're keeping track of everything that's been suggested, anything that's about 50 people or less. And there are several, and they're on our list. Bemis is one. Burbank was suggested by many people, and I go to WIMPs, and I am not going to let Burbank go. So, but it is on the list. So there are several that we're keeping close track of, and acknowledge that people are trying so hard to keep them alive. And, you know, maybe that's another project down the road. We don't do a show on vanished towns. We do a show on thriving towns and see if we can help them out. So, yeah.
Lodi, here in Clay County.
Yep.
You know, they wouldn't pass a bond issue to build a courthouse here because they thought the county seat ought to be moved to Lodi.
I want to get to that one too. That one's on private land. I believe a farmer owns that one. Yeah.
All right, time to go.
Yeah. Thank you.